Hi, hello everyone.
Hello, Professor İbrahim Kaya.
Good morning.
Good morning, welcome.
It's still morning in Turkey and in many other places around the world, I guess.
Let me please inform you and your topic.
Please.
Good morning, everybody. Today, Professor İbrahim Kaya from Istanbul University, Department of International Public Law, will make a presentation on COVID-19 restrictions, WHO and human rights. And we have, I think, a short of time, so we'll finish 5 or 10 minutes earlier from the expected time. So please, Professor, could you please presentation?
My topic is COVID-19 restrictions, WHO and human rights, as presented by Dr. Maden. I am Ibrahim Kaya, Professor of International Law at Istanbul University, Faculty of Law. You could see my email, kayai@hotmail.com. You could reach me anytime with your questions and anything you wanted to raise. So, the current COVID-19 pandemic has been declared public emergency on 30th of January 2020 after the Chinese notification of the new disease on the last day of the previous year. However, despite reframing the situation as a pandemic on the 11th of March 2020, the World Health Organization didn't recommend any measures limiting international trade or travel, but only measures for containment, including active surveillance, early detection, isolation, and contact tracing. It also pointed out that travel measures that significantly interfere with the international traffic needed to be short in duration and proportionate to the public health risks. With the rapid spread of the disease around the globe and increasing death toll, countries began to criticize Chinese honesty to fulfill its duties under the international health regulations, as well as the organization's ability to respond to the pandemic by pointing out its inadequacies in recommending proper measures. And we all know that some countries, including the US, even accused the World Health Organization as biased towards Chinese interests. So there are a lot of international legal issues in conjunction with the current COVID-19 pandemic. But today, we will be looking at the human rights issues with special references to COVID-19 restrictions and the WHO's mandate. As you know, the current epidemic of COVID-19 has created a lot of problems worldwide, from economy to legal issues. As a matter of fact, pandemics have always been a global phenomenon known to humanity for many centuries. Therefore, there were different mechanisms to prepare and manage this problem at different points of history. However, after the momentum, after the momentum gained by the globalization in the 19th century, international efforts aiming to cooperate against epidemics focused on creating international institutions for this purpose. So at that time, even at that time, everyone who was responsible to deal with epidemics and of course pandemics understood that a mechanism and organization was needed. In these new institutions, one of the key issues was to strike the balance between controlling the spread of disease and to keep the international supply chain open. So on the one hand, the right to health was at stake, but on the other hand, economy must go on. So a right balance had to be kept. After the Second World War, international institutional cooperation reached its peak with the establishment of the United Nations. And as you know, the UN has its specialized agencies, and in the area of health, its specialist agency is the World Health Organization. And it was established in 1948. WHO is endowed with typical international organs that all international organizations have the same or the similar organs. It had the assembly, which is the decision-making body, executive board to implement decisions and sometimes to make some decisions, and some powers might have been delegated by the World Health Assembly to the executive board, and the secretariat, which consists of the director general and his or her team, plus technical committees and regional offices. Here you could see the objective of the World Health Organization. Article 1 of the Constitution of the WHO reads, the objective of the World Health Organization shall be attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. So we may interpret this as a reference to right to health. And right to health is a very important human rights, and it is directly linked to right to life. Here you could see the functions of the WHO. It is a long list from A to M. Its mandate includes monitoring public health risks by promoting policies to eradicate communicable diseases and to reduce non-communicable ones, coordinating responses to emergencies like pandemics, and giving technical assistance to countries all over the world. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all the functions of the organization, as I said, from A to M, but it doesn't stop there, and it continues from A to V. Only 3 letters of the alphabets are missing, I guess: W, Y, and Z. Apart from these 3 articles, all of the remaining articles are enlisted here. So we may say that its functions have a lengthy and a wide coverage. I would like to refer a treaty-making power of the WHO from the international legal point of view. It's very important. The WHO provides a forum to adopt normative measures like treaties and regulations. Here we could see that the Assembly of the WHO has the authority to adopt conventions or agreements with respect to any matter within the competence of the organizations. A 2/3 majority is needed to adopt such a convention, but it's up to the member states, members of the WHO, to ratify the convention in accordance with their own international constitutional requirements, in accordance with their national law. This is for the international treaties. And also there is another mechanism. Some may prefer to call it, again, the treaty-making process, but it's somehow unusual. Again, the Health Assembly has the authority to adopt regulations concerning a sanitary and quarantine requirements and other procedures designed to prevent the international spread of disease. This is the part which relates to COVID-19 issue, and there are more areas where the Health Assembly has the authority to adopt regulations. Although the technical title of the document is called regulation, it is binding because Article 22 reads, regulations adopted pursuant to the previous article come into force for all members after due notification has been given of their adoption. So as long as the members do not opt out for not be bound by the regulations adopted unilaterally by the WHO will be binding on member states. So in a sense, as I said, this is a bit unusual for international law making because the force of these regulations comes from above. In a sense, as long as the regulations are concerned, the WHO might be called as a supranational organization. It has right to adopt binding regulations on its members, but of course, members may choose not to be bound by the regulations. If they do not choose otherwise, regulations will become binding on members automatically. And as we have seen, to prevent the international spread of disease, the WHO has the power to adopt binding regulations. So they are called International Health Regulations, or IHR in short. IHR are an international legal instrument adopted by the WHO and binding on all member states to prevent and respond to public health risks that have the potential to cross borders. The first versions of the IHR was adopted by the Assembly in 1951, just 3 years later after the WHO was established. And in 1969, and there were some revisions in 1973 and 1981 amendments, but the current version was adopted in 2005. So when we say international health regulations, we mean the most current version, which was adopted in 2005. And the purpose of the current version and scope of it is here in Article 2. The purpose and scope of these regulations are to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to international spread of disease in ways that are commensurate with and restricted to public health risks and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. Again, we could see that on the one hand, okay, the main aim is to prevent and control the pandemic or epidemic, but at the same time, unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade, meaning economy is something that should be avoided. So again, there is a concern to strike the right balance between health and economy. I mean, this is almost the case all over the world today. In many countries, governments uphold that on the one hand, they have to respect the health requirements of their citizens, but on the other hand, they try to keep their economies open, and also they try to make that their educational system is at work. So it's not only one-sided issue, but it has many different phases, and human rights is a very important element in this process. Here again, we could see the principles, Article 3, Paragraph 1. The implementation of these regulations shall be with full respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. I added the italics. I try to underline the importance of human rights here, okay? The regulations was adopted by the WHO, but surely they will be implemented. But again, when they are implemented, full respect should be paid for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. Again, this underlines the importance of human rights, which is stated in the underlying principles of the IHR. I'll come to this point in more detail in a minute. But first, I need to look at how public health emergence of international concern is announced. IHR defined the rights and obligations of countries to report public health events and establish a number of procedures that the WHO must follow in its work to uphold global health security. As pointed out before, one such procedure is to declare public health emergency after taking into account the relevant factors with regard to the gravity of the risk involved, as well as the advice from an internationally made up committee of experts, and the committee is called IHR Emergency Committee. So it's up to the Director General of the WHO to determine for the public health emergency of international concern. There is a detailed procedure laid down in Article 12 and also in Article 49. As I said, the Director General has to take into account the relevant factors with regard to the gravity of the risk involved, as well as the advice from the emergency committee. I'm not going to go all the detail here, but when you examine this Article 49, you will see the procedure. But if we come to the current point, taking into account all the procedures, the WHO decided to declare public health emergency of international concern, and today it's globally accepted as the pandemic. But I need to make a criticism here. The meetings of the emergency committee is not public. So in fact, we really do not know what is recommended by the emergency committee. So it's up to the Director General to take into account what is recommended by the emergency committee. A kind of similar thing happens in national systems too. In many states, of course, it's the power of the governments to make decisions, but many governments prefer to establish science committees or science commissions, and they claim that they act on the recommendations made by these science or scientific committees, sometimes referred as health committees. But as citizens, many people do not know what is recommended by these scientific committees. But at the end of the day, it's up to their governments to make the decisions. Anyway, what happens if a public health emergency is announced? Under Article 15, temporary recommendations might be taken. After declaring public health emergency of international concern, the Director General takes charge in responding to health emergency and begin to recommend temporary measures to countries for managing the risks. The term temporary is used here, meaning that the pandemic or the epidemic is something that will stay with us for a limited period of time, and these recommendations or measures would be implemented for this period. So after everything becomes normal, we will not implement these measures anymore. Again, very detailed article. If it has been determined that a public health emergency of international concern is occurring, the Director General shall issue temporary recommendations in accordance with the procedure we have seen previously. This kind of recommendations may be modified or extended as appropriate as long as the pandemic continues. Temporary recommendations may include health measures to be implemented by the states experiencing the public health emergency of international concern regarding persons, baggage, cargo containers, conveyances, goods, and or postal parcels to prevent or reduce the international spread of disease and avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic. Again, we could see a reference to avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic, again meaning economy. But on the other hand, obviously there will be some restrictions on the movement of persons and goods. So again, a right balance should be found between these two important objectives. After declaring public health emergency of international concern, the Director General takes charge in responding to the health emergency and begin to recommend temporary measures to countries for managing their risks. Countries, states will normally act upon such advice because Article 42 reads, health measures will be initiated and completed without delay. So it is binding on member states. They should be applied in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner. So each country has to announce its policy on this issue, and this has to be known to public and should be implemented in a non-discriminatory manner. Of course, there are possibilities to make a kind of discrimination on the basis of the countries where this kind of diseases occur, and in some countries there might be no risk and there might be discrimination for the travelers coming from these countries, risk-free countries, for example, or the goods coming from risk-free countries. One of the main purposes of the IHR procedure is to manage the risks involved, but also reducing the need for unnecessary controlling measures negatively affecting the global economy. Also, countries may adopt stricter measures under Article 43. Under these articles, states, parties are free to adopt stricter measures in accordance with their relevant national law, but it doesn't stop there, it continues, in accordance with their obligations under international law. Again, almost all the countries all over the world are parties to international human rights instruments. Whatever measure they decide to take should be in accordance with these international human rights treaties, including European Convention on Human Rights. As I pointed out, there might be measures relating to entry of travelers into a country. Article 31 tries to draw a line between what is allowed and what is not. It says invasive medical examination, vaccination, or other prophylaxis shall not be required as a condition to entry of any traveler to the territory of a state party. But there are some exceptions. Medical examination, vaccination, or other prophylaxis or proof of vaccination might be allowed. For example, if someone visits Turkey from Europe, Turkey has right to ask for a proof of documentation that says the person is COVID-19 negative. So prior health checks might be required. But again, the least invasive and intrusive medical examination that would achieve the public health is allowed. And of course, additional health measures that prevent or control the spread of disease, like isolation, quarantine, or placing the traveler under public health observation, for example, in the residential place of the person, say for 14 days, is allowed. But by doing that, international human rights obligations of the states should be honored and observed, because Article 32 reads, in implementing these health measures, states will treat travelers with respect for their dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. So, okay, the travelers might be put in quarantine, but states are not allowed to put them in prisons, for example. And of course, states should minimize any discomfort, distress associated with such measures. Again, states under a duty to treat all travelers with courtesy and respect. States should take into consideration the gender, sociocultural, ethnic, or religious concerns of travelers, and states are under a duty to provide or arrange for adequate food and water. And these are the human rights of all travelers that should be respected by the states. Of course, the personal data is a very important element in this process, because to put someone in quarantine, the state should know that the person carries a risk for public health, but how the state knows that depends on the personal data, depends on the test results of this person, and this is directly related to personal data. According to Article 45 of the AHR, health information collected or received by a state person to this IHR from another state party or from the WHO, which refers to an identified or identifiable person, will be kept confidential. So in a sense, it's the responsibility of the state who receives this kind of data to keep it confidential, and the state is also under a duty to process this data anonymously as required by national law. Again, the international obligations of the states concerning data protection and data processing come into play with regard to COVID-19 issues. I'm checking the time and I'm almost out of time. Just to make a few concluding remarks, I could say that the WHO has a unique role to play in cases of health emergencies by way of deciding to declare public health emergency of international concern. However, this role is closely related with member states' duty to notify such risks in a timely manner and give all the detailed information in their possession. As one may guess, this requires a lot of goodwill and very tightly scheduled cooperative work between the WHO and the member states. According to reports based on the evidence showing the results of the IHR's implementation on the ground, there have been numerous inadequacies to face future outbreaks. And as a final point, I should underline that all human rights obligations, including European Convention on Human Rights, should always be respected all the time by the members of WHO. Thank you very much. I'm free to answer your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this useful presentation.
I can see two written questions, one from Ertan and one from Özgenor.
Yes, please, Professor.
Ertan Yıldız asks that, what do you think about the success of WHO in fighting against the COVID-19 in terms of taking swift action? Can we blame the WHO for its failure to control the spread of the virus, as WHO gave priority to protect international traffic and trade? Yeah, it's a point that's made previously by the US President Donald Trump and the WHO in particular, and the UN in general became a point of criticism. To a certain extent, the criticism is right, but from time to time, this kind of international organizations are used as scapegoats, because everything depends on the goodwill of the member states of such organizations. As long as an adequate information is not provided by the member states, in the case of the COVID-19, it's China. There was nothing for the WHO to recommend, for example, because this kind of international organizations lack some operative mechanisms. They do not have their inspection teams to send without the consent of the relevant state to the state and to gather information. But when we look at the IHR, which was adopted in 2005, not only the information provided by the member states, but also the information gathered from NGOs might be used. So there has been a bit improvement on information gathering, but still the information gathered with regard to the COVID-19 from China was not enough, this is my personal view, to declare a public health emergency. And if an inspection or investigation is to be opened with regard to WHO, we will find out what is recommended by the, for example, emergency committee, and whether the Director General was slow to adopt measures. I mean, we really lack information and we do not know what they talked about in closed doors. And the second question, Özgenur, should states share burden to prevent pandemic or fight separately? I mean, the general answer, yes, but the problem, how? Of course, burden sharing is very important, but every state should contribute this burden sharing in accordance with its financial and economic sources. And it's, I guess, as a wish from a professor of international law, states with huge budgets should contribute more in favor of less developed states. But there, again, at the end of the day, it will be left to the goodwill of these states. And the final question, okay, not final, two more, Esra and Begüm. Esra says, I think I have a problem with my audio. During the pandemic, we witnessed governments like the US try to withdraw from, yes, correct. I mean, are you able to see the questions, or do I have to read it all the way?
All the attendees can see the questions from the...
Okay, it's good. So it's burden sharing. I'm not the only person who has to read, but everyone can read. Anyway. Again, it's a political choice by the current US administration to withdraw from WHO, and we will see then what happens. But again, it's a lot in legal sense. I mean, of course, it's a political choice, but in technical terms, any state is free to withdraw or exit from an international organization. And the Begum's question, on what basis can WHO restrict? I mean, the WHO is not in a position to restrict the freedom of movement. Very good point, but the IHR, International Health Regulations, give the WHO to make recommendations, and upon these recommendations, states are those that restricts the freedom of movement. On what basis? On the basis of the available data to prevent the spread of diseases. As you may remember, even in Turkey, it was the Turkish government that put a ban on the travel between different states. So all the information is taken into account, and to prevent the further spread of diseases, this kind of measures could be taken by the states. Normally what happens is that the states parties, members of the WHO share the information they have had, and the WHO at this point could see the whole picture, not only the picture of what's happening in a single country, but in the region or all over the globe. And on this information, on this basis, can issue recommendations. As I said, when we look at Article 42, this, although they are called recommendations, it binds states to act in accordance with these recommendations.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. In your opinion, do you think that the role of the WHO in pandemics is still relevant, since we see that even member states are deviating in their practices? And it's also highly argued that the WHO emergency committee is acting in an undemocratic manner due to not adhering to the principle of transparency, and notes are not being publicized. So what will happen if a specific recommendation has been made by the committee on a specific measure to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, and on the long run it turns out that this specific measure was inadequate? Who will check the procedures of the committee as such, also since the draft articles on the responsibility of international organizations are not yet adopted?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Feiruz. Very good and lengthy question. And you touched upon very important points. Of course, the responsibility of international organizations issue is extremely relevant here, and unfortunately, we do not have a binding convention on this issue. As you mentioned, only draft articles, but some of the draft articles reflect the customary law, and that's why we may claim that at least this part of articles are binding, but at the end of the day, there is no court to file a petition against an international organization. I mean, On the international level, I don't want to make it very simple, but to a certain extent, it's the case. Almost everything depends on the goodwill of states, and of course, it's up to states to reform the WHO procedures and the role of this emergency committee. And apparently, I would like to say that with regard to COVID-19, the knowledge and data was at least at that time very limited. I remember that including in Turkey and in many other states, face masks were not recommended at the beginning. Then the humanity has become to understand the importance and the role played by the face masks to prevent, or at least the control of the spread of disease. So we witness a process that evolves by the passage of time, and of course, international organizations and to a large extent, states themselves are not, have not been prepared to tackle with this issue. So it is a dynamic issue and a dynamic process is needed. And during this process, international organizations failed to a certain extent, states have failed, and even individuals have failed. So this is something new, and we need to adapt ourselves with the realities of this dynamic process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We have one just last question, and then we will finish shortly.
Okay,
Ozan, please. Can you ask your question, Ozan Geyik?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Professor, first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. You have mentioned that regulations of the WHO are binding unless unless a member state put a reservation or reject that regulation. So the question that came to my mind is, Russia has recently declared that they found a vaccine. So my question is that, can the WHO take a binding decision to force vaccination of the citizens of member states? Thank you.
Again, very political and I don't know how to call it, open-minded question. So anything is possible, everything is possible, but I mean, from a legal point of view, I could say the regulations are binding and recommendations taken in accordance with regulations are binding. At this moment, I mean, if you ask me whether WHO may make a recommendation which is binding for vaccination, the technical answer is yes. Okay, but of course we know that most of the states are hesitant to follow this kind of recommendations. Even other recommendations of the WHO have not always been followed by the states.
Thank you very much, Professor İbrahim Kaya.